I grew up hearing all kinds of ghost stories, but none terrified me as much as the tale of the Teke Teke. It's not just a story parents tell to scare their kids. It's something that happened to someone I knew. I had an old classmate named Yuto. He was quiet, kept to himself, but we were friends. One summer, we were both in high school, and Yuto told me he'd seen something strange near the train station late at night. It was during summer break, and we were hanging out at the arcade when he brought it up. He said he was walking home after dark, and as he passed by the station, he heard something. At first, it sounded like the clattering of metal, but then it got louder, more distinct. He looked around, thinking it was maybe a stray animal or something. But what he saw wasn't an animal. He described seeing a woman, well, not a whole woman. She was missing her lower half. The upper half of her body was crawling across the ground, dragging itself with her arms. Her face was twisted, almost inhuman, and her long matted hair obscured her eyes. The sound he heard was the stumps of her torso scraping against the concrete. Yuto tried to run, but the woman was fast, unnaturally fast. She didn't crawl, she floated, her torso hovering just inches off the ground as she closed the distance between them. He managed to escape by ducking into an alley, but when he came out, the woman was gone. I didn't believe him at first. It was just too bizarre, like something straight out of a horror movie. But Yuto was serious, and he swore that he wasn't making it up. He even told me to be careful around the train station at night. A few weeks later, Yuto didn't come to school. Days passed, and no one could get in touch with him. Eventually, the news came out. Yuto had been found dead near the train station. His body was, well, only half of it was found. The police said it was an accident, that he'd fallen onto the tracks and been hit by a train, but I knew the truth. The legend of the Teke Teke says that if you see her, she'll come for you. And when she does, she'll cut you in half, just like she was. I've stayed away from that train station ever since. But late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I still hear the sound. The scraping, the clattering. I was 12 years old when I first heard the story of Kuchisake Onna. It was during lunch break at school. My friends and I were sitting under a tree, eating our bentos, when one of them started talking about this creepy woman who appears out of nowhere and asks a simple question. Am I beautiful? If you say no, she kills you. If you say yes, she pulls down her mask to reveal her hideously slit mouth, and then she'll cut your face to match hers. No matter how you answer, you're doomed. I didn't believe it. I mean, it was just a stupid urban legend, right? But then something happened that made me question everything. It was a rainy afternoon, and I had stayed late at school to finish an assignment. By the time I left, it was already dark, and the streets were eerily quiet. As I walked home, I noticed a woman standing under a streetlight up ahead. She had long, straight hair, and was wearing a surgical mask, which wasn't too unusual, especially in the colder months. As I got closer, she turned to face me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. She asked me in a soft, almost sweet voice, "Am I beautiful?" I froze. The memory of the urban legend flashed through my mind. I forced a smile and said, "Yes, you are." She reached up and slowly pulled down her mask, revealing a gaping, jagged smile that stretched from ear to ear. Blood was dripping from the fresh cuts, and her teeth were sharp, glinting in the dim light. "Am I beautiful now?" she asked again, her voice taking on a menacing tone. I was too terrified to move. My mind raced. The story said there was no way to escape, but I remembered something, a trick one of my friends had mentioned. I took a deep breath and replied, "You're average." For a moment, she seemed confused, her mutilated face twisting in thought. That brief hesitation was all I needed. I bolted, running as fast as I could without looking back. When I finally reached my house, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I never saw her again, but I still think about that night. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't remembered that trick. Would I be walking around with a smile like hers? I had always been fascinated with folklore, so when I heard about the Gashadokuro, I thought it was just another creepy story meant to scare kids. But after what happened to me, I'm not so sure anymore. The Gashadokuro is said to be a giant skeleton made from the bones of people who died in wars or from starvation. It's over 15 meters tall and roams the countryside at night, searching for living victims. If you hear a ringing in your ears, it means the Gashadokuro is near. and once it spots you, there's no escape. It will grab you, crush you, and drink your blood. One night, I decided to visit a rural area with some friends. We had heard rumors of strange things happening in the mountains, disappearances, strange noises at night. Being thrill seekers, we thought it would be fun to explore. We arrived at a small village at the foot of the mountains, and the locals were less than thrilled to see us. They warned us not to go near the old battlefield in the hills, but we shrugged it off as superstitious nonsense. That night, we set up camp near the base of the mountain. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness. As the night wore on, we started hearing strange noises. Distant creaking, like old wood, and a faint ringing sound, like a bell far off in the distance. I didn't think much of it at first, but the sound started to get louder. The others noticed it too. Then, out of nowhere, I felt an intense pressure in my ears. It was painful, like something was pushing down on me from all sides. The ringing grew louder, more insistent, and suddenly I saw it. In the distance, emerging from the tree line, was the Gashadokuro. It was massive, towering over the trees, its bony frame illuminated by the faint moonlight. Its hollow eye sockets seemed to lock onto us, and I could feel the weight of its gaze. We were frozen, unable to move as it began to walk toward us, the ground shaking with each step. One of my friends snapped out of it and screamed for us to run. We bolted through the trees, but the Gashadokuro was fast, faster than something that size should have been. I could hear the creaking of its bones and the heavy thud of its feet behind us. The ringing in my ears was unbearable now, a high-pitched screech that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I glanced back and saw the giant skeleton's hand reaching out, inches away from grabbing me. My heart pounded, and I pushed myself to run faster than I ever had before. We made it back to the village, out of breath and terrified. The locals didn't ask what happened. They just nodded grimly, as if they knew. One of the elders pulled us aside and told us that the Gashadokuro only appears when the spirits of the dead are restless. The battlefield in the hills had seen countless deaths, and the spirits had never been put to rest. We left the village the next day, shaken and silent. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan on it, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear that ringing in my ears. I wonder if the Gashadokuro is still looking for me. I had always been drawn to old architecture, temples, bridges, castles, the kind of structures that seem to have a soul of their own. So, when I was offered a job to help restore an ancient castle deep in the Japanese countryside, I jumped at the opportunity. The place had been abandoned for decades, and the locals avoided it, whispering about cursed grounds and restless spirits. I didn't believe in any of that. To me, it was just a fascinating piece of history waiting to be uncovered. The castle was a massive stone structure built over 500 years ago, during the Sengoku period. It stood atop a hill, overlooking a vast forest. When I first arrived, it looked beautiful, yet eerie, like time had passed it by. The stone walls were weathered, and vines had overgrown the courtyard, but it still had a kind of majestic presence. However, there was something else too, a heaviness in the air, like the place was holding its breath. On the first day, the project lead gave me and my team a brief history of the castle. He mentioned that there were rumors of Hitobashira, human pillars, being buried within the walls during its construction. Apparently, it was an old tradition where people were sacrificed and entombed alive within the foundations to protect the building from disasters and ensure its longevity. I had heard about this practice before, but I always thought it was just folklore, stories passed down to scare people. The lead assured us that these were just myths, though he seemed uncomfortable talking about it. As we began the restoration work, strange things started happening almost immediately. At first, it was small stuff. Tools going missing, cold drafts blowing through rooms, even though the windows were sealed. The faint sound of footsteps echoing through the empty corridors at night. My team and I laughed it off, thinking it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us. But as the days passed, things got worse. One afternoon, we were repairing a section of the outer wall when one of the workers found something odd. A small, hollow space behind the stone. Curious, we chipped away at the wall, thinking it might be a hidden room or passage. But what we uncovered was far more disturbing. Inside the hollow space was a human skeleton, its bones crumbling with age, but still clearly recognizable. The body had been bricked up in the wall, standing upright, its arms bound to its sides. We stopped work immediately and called the authorities. They came, examined the site, and removed the remains, but they didn't seem surprised. It was as if they had expected it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the skeleton, buried alive, entombed in the walls for centuries. The thought of it made my skin crawl, but worse than that was the sound. I started hearing faint whispers, like voices carried by the wind, murmuring just beyond my understanding. I tried to tell myself it was just the stress of the discovery, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next day, several workers quit, saying they had seen shadows moving through the halls or felt cold hands brushing against their skin. The rest of us tried to continue, but the atmosphere had changed. The castle felt darker, more oppressive, like something was watching us, waiting. Then came the night that changed everything. I had stayed late, going over some blueprints in one of the lower rooms when I heard it. A faint knocking sound, like something tapping against the stone walls. At first, I thought it was one of the other workers, but when I called out, no one answered. The knocking continued, slow and rhythmic, as if it was coming from inside the walls. I followed the sound down a narrow corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking grew louder as I approached one of the inner walls, the same kind of stone wall where we had found the skeleton. I pressed my ear against the cold stone, and that's when I heard it clearly. Faint, desperate whispers. "Let me out." The voice was so quiet, so weak, but it was there. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be my imagination. But the knocking continued. Faster now. More insistent. Like someone or something was trapped behind the wall trying to escape. I ran back to the main hall, but the moment I stepped into the room, I froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure. A woman. Dressed in tattered, ancient clothes, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark. She stared at me, unmoving, and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, she said, "I was sacrificed." The room grew unbearably cold, and I could feel a pressure in the air, like something was closing in on me. I turned to run, but the figure vanished, leaving me alone in the dark. I didn't sleep that night. I packed my things and left the next morning, refusing to ever go back to that cursed castle. Let me out. Weeks later, I heard that the restoration project had been abandoned. Too many workers had quit, claiming to see the same ghostly figure I had, hearing the same whispers in the walls. The locals said the castle was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had been sacrificed as Hitobashira. I try not to think about it, but sometimes late at night when the wind is still and the house is quiet, I swear I can hear faint knocking on the walls. And when I do, I remember the woman's hollow eyes, her whispered words, and the knowledge that some things are never meant to be uncovered. The Hitobashira will always watch over the places where they were sacrificed, their souls trapped, forever waiting. Let me out!